Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Join us as we explore ruminant nutrition and the impact of mycotoxins. Here, we challenge your curiosity and explore new industry insights and research to optimize your herd's health and performance. All right. Hey, welcome, everybody, to another edition of Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. I'm your host, Scott Zehr, and today I am happy to be joined by none other than our Vice President of Nutrition here at Agrarian, one of my friends in the company here, Dr. Larry Roth. Larry, thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Larry, we are going to dive into a topic today that is near and dear to both of our hearts. One, because we work at Agrarian and we believe in defending and protecting cows for a lifetime. And one of the main things that we do to defend and protect that cow for a lifetime is mitigate mycotoxins, we feel, in a way that is probably better than anybody else out there, with some unique things that we do with our specialized bacteria, L-form bacteria. And I've asked you this question before: what is a mycotoxin? And I'm gonna just kind of give the people an overview. So, right, mycotoxins aren't these bad actors that the world has put in your cow's TMR with the sole purpose of hurting your cow's production and health. They're just the byproduct of a mold that's just trying to survive, Larry. And unfortunately, our cattle in the U.S. and abroad are the collateral damage. Mm-hmm. And producers' bottom lines ends up being the collateral damage of mycotoxins. But what I do want to kind of bring out today is, let's talk about a specific mycotoxin today, Larry. And we're going to start with DON. Mm-hmm. And we have discussed in the past some things that DON is kind of known for, like disrupting rumen microbial balance. But I want to take it a step further with you, if you could, and help the audience really understand what DON is and what it does, both directly and indirectly. So I guess my first question for you is, why is DON actually so disruptive to the rumen microbial balance? And what is it doing once it gets in the rumen?
All right. Excellent. All right. Thank you, Scott. Great way to start off our conversation. I think we have to stop for a moment and say, with our ruminants, what makes them unique from the non-ruminants, the pigs and the chickens, is we have this 55-gallon fermentation vat between their ribs. And so we have to think about everything that comes into that fermentation vat and its effect on microbial balance and the resulting fermentation in the fermentation products. So what does DON have to do with all of that? Well, DON is something that we might call it static. It kind of stops the bacteria where they are. It's not cidal in killing the bacteria, but think of it as slowing them down and stopping them where they are. They're not dead. So talk about genetics for a moment. Ribosomes are in the cell, and they generate proteins that cause all kinds of things to happen within the cell. Well, DON happens to kind of tie up these ribosomes so we don't get the proteins created. So the microbes, and when I say microbes, I'm talking about bacteria and protozoa. They slow down. They're not dead, but they're not functioning like they should be. And they're supposed to be
almost like a paralysis.
You could think of it that way. Slowing them down, they're really not doing anything. They're not functioning at the level that they should be. So consequently, we're not turning the diet into energy and into microbial protein. So if the cells aren't increasing in number, we're not creating the microbial protein that is the ideal amino acid balance for the cow. so that we get milk production, we get immune support, and we get reproduction. Things are just kind of slowed down and not functioning. And so consequently, if our fermentation has been slowed down in the rumen, we're not going to get the rumen turnover, and we're not going to get as much feed intake as what we want. And to me, everything starts right there. What happens to our fermentation balance? And we've slowed it down.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, let's just, I guess, run this out before we move on a little bit more about Don. If you're telling me we're not getting the fermentation done correctly in the rumen, and we have digestion or something happening somewhere else, right? Is that what we would call hindgut fermentation?
Okay, great question.
Is that we have undigested starch in the hindgut causing what issues?
To me, the digestive tract is like a river. Whatever ends up in the river at the headwaters is going to flow all of the way down. So ideally, we would have fiber and starch being fermented in the rumen. The fermentation products are going to be absorbed for energy in the rumen. The microbial protein flows on down to the small intestine, broken down and absorbed as amino acids. But if we're not breaking down digesta, be it both fiber and starch in the rumen, those nutrients are going to flow on to the hindgut, and we have fermentation taking place there that we don't want to have taken place. So, Scott, I have a boring life. One of the things I like to do is screen manure. And when we do that, we have an idea of what's happening in the hindgut. And so we notice that with cows who are challenged by DON, that quite often, not always, but quite often, feed intakes can be a little bit lower than what we want. And we notice a more erratic manure. Well, right there, we're having two of our key things. Less ruminal fermentation. Cows aren't going to eat as much. Not breaking everything down in the rumen like it should be. Nutrients flow to the hindgut, and we have our erratic manure. So we're starting to put all of these dots together, why we see what we do.
It's a pretty distinct cascade effect there, I always come back to, as we learn more about Don, and maybe this is just a me thing, Larry, but boy, I can remember being on the dairy in the early 2000s, and it was like you wanted to the word acidosis was like a trigger for nutritionists. And when we would see symptoms to me that looked like the cows were acidotic, and the nutritionist is saying, ain't no way I'm feeding your cows to be acidotic. It just makes me wonder, Larry, over the course of time, how many nutritionists got replaced with another nutritionist because the dairyman didn't understand, or somebody didn't understand that maybe what's going on here is a Don issue that's causing things to look like acidosis.
Exactly. And again, we go back to the manure screening. We have too much fermentation taking place in the hindgut. Well, that's because we got acidosis. We've got too low rumen pH. We're not having fiber fermented like it should be in the rumen and starch. And we make a conclusion that we've got acidosis, when really it's not acidosis.
In the
It's
sense
not
that
ruminal acidosis. It's more of a
yes,
hindgut acidosis because we got nutrients flowing down the river to the hindgut. So we're trying to make a diagnosis, and we're not understanding everything that's happening there in the rumen.
yep.
So I think that you're right, Scott. There are probably decisions that have been made in the past that were incorrect because we've got DON messing ruminal fermentation up. Oh, so we've got acidosis. So that means we need to feed a little bit more fiber, right? But DON has, unfortunately, a greater effect upon fiber fermenting bacteria than it does the starch. So we've just increased our fiber in our diet. Now we're slowing it down, fiber fermentation down, excuse me. So we're getting less energy there. And you can just see how there's a cascading effect that goes on with all of this, not really understanding how DON is negatively impacting the rumen microorganisms.
You know, Larry, you talk about this cascade effect, and it just makes me think in terms of, let's go back to your river analogy. I live in an area of New York right near the Black River, and it's one of the largest rivers in the country. I think it carries quite a bit of water, and it connects into Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that water that flows in there ends up in the ocean. It takes some time for something that's put into the Black River down at the mouth to make its way all the way to the Lake Ontario, up the St. Lawrence Seaway and out to the ocean,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where you might not even notice that anything actually was wrong in that water until it's way too late. And, I go back to, I made this comment to you once before. I think there's only been one time in my career that I truly felt like we were dealing with an acute DON issue. And when I say acute, I'm talking like a smoking gun kind of issue, where we did some sampling. The DON was, I think it was like 16 ppm in the diet. There was like a date and time where they started on some corn and there was a crash in milk, and all systems pointed to this was a big time smoking gun. But the way you've described it, and when I think of the river analogy you used, that's not normal. That's maybe, there's probably a reason I've only seen it one time in my career. To me, it sounds like what you're describing is a slow erosion of the riverbank. It takes a
Well,
lot of time for these symptoms to potentially show up in ways that we can measure, like profitability or certain KPIs. Where am I at with that? Is that about right?
I think that you're right with that. The challenge I would have is that word acute. I think you were right to use the word acute in the situation you were describing. I think in most of our other situations, we have subacute, or I don't know if I want to say subclinical, but maybe
Yeah.
subacute, in
Yep.
which we are adding another inflammation source to the cow who's already having to deal with so many other sources of inflammation.
Yep.
And we're kind of getting to that final straw that breaks the camel's back. That
Yep.
final little bit of inflammation that she can't deal with. And then things just get exaggerated. I should say exaggerated. Things just get bigger from that point because we went beyond the point of what the cow could handle. And then
Yeah.
everything else starts to become more of an issue. So we've reduced fiber fermentation a little bit in the rumen. What could be wrong with that? We've reduced starch fermentation a little bit in the rumen. What could be wrong with that? Well, now we don't have as much microbial protein presented to the small intestine to be broken down to amino acids and absorbed. We've sent more nutrients to the hindgut to be fermented. What could go wrong with all of that? Then we add in things like leaky gut that can come from a number of different non-mycotoxin related situations, but we do have that. And so we've been focusing upon DON so far in our discussion and its effect upon ruminal fermentation. Let's talk about DON and what it can do to the intestinal lining, contributing to leaky gut. So we get more and more inflammation challenges on the cow. How many of these inflammation sources can she deal with? Because she's a high
Well,
functioning biological unit, but how many inflammation challenges can she handle where we're asking her to do so much more? She's producing what, 120, 140 pounds of milk. She's got a much greater glucose need than the cow who's down there at 50 pounds. Completely different needs. And we're asking her to do all of this biological and physiological work, but yet she's also trying to stay alive and deal with all these mycotoxin related inflammations, as well as other types inflammation challenges going on.
well, I'm glad you brought that up because I don't think we talk about this aspect enough of DON increasing the permeability of rumen and intestinal walls and loosening those tight junctions in the epithelial tissues. And we talk about it a lot as it pertains to like T2, HT2 toxin.
Mm-hmm.
But, it just, I'm going to come back and maybe sound a little bit silly. There's a reason it's called a toxin. So expand on that a little bit. I mean, I guess I'd like to hear your take on this because when we think of like T2, HT2 affecting the mucosal tissues and the soft tissue linings and the small intestine, we think of creating ulcers and really some pretty nasty stuff. I don't think I've ever really heard you talk about DON being that aggressive, but I guess probably in high enough levels, it'd probably be something similar to what we see with T2, HT2, but
Mm-hmm.
just walk us through the cascade effect of weakening those epithelial cells and increasing the permeability in the rumen and small intestine.
You bet. All right. So think of the small intestine lining as being the castle wall to keep the barbarians, the bad stuff in the digestive tract, and out of the body. But DON can weaken our castle wall, reduce the viability of that castle wall. Now we got greater permeability. The tight junctions that were supposed to be tight between intestinal cells are now open. We got an interstate highway for all of the mycotoxins and other digests to flow into the body. And now the immune system has to deal with all of these invaders. So now we have glucose that we were hoping was going to go for follicle development and supporting embryo development, that now glucose plus go to lactose creation for milk. Now that glucose has to go to support the immune system. So we've reallocated nutrients from productive purposes to dealing with the increased permeability due to the leaky gut, due to the DON, there at the digestive tract lining. And then we have the liver, the body's biochemical factory. So we got leaky gut, we've got stuff ending up in the body that shouldn't be there. The immune system's having to deal with that. But these metabolites, these toxins that flow on to the liver, the biochemical factory has to deal with that. And the liver is not as efficient at metabolizing other nutrients. Oh, and by the way, we don't have as many nutrients to go to the liver because we don't have the ruminal fermentation that we wanted. So it's one great big cycle that we see going on. And little bits here, little bits there have a greater aggregate effect when they all come together. So we want each part of the body to function the way that it should be. Maximum ruminal fermentation in the rumen, nutrients not flowing to the hindgut, the right balance of bacteria in the small intestine and large intestine. We don't want pathogens, we don't want mycotoxins affecting digestive tract wall permeability. We don't want invaders getting into the body, reallocating nutrients from productive purposes to immune support. We don't want metabolites ending up in the liver, causing bad things to happen there and not metabolizing nutrients the right way. So we're dealing with a biological system, the cow, in which she has many biological systems. The rumen, the small intestine, the large intestine, the immune system, the liver, all of these things have to be working together in the right way. And little pokes here, little pushes over there, they come together for a greater effect. And now the cow is not living up to her genetic potential for milk production. Then the diet is there, the nutrients are there, but they're not being fermented in the proper way in the rumen. They're not being absorbed in the proper way in the small intestine. They're unfortunately being fermented in the hindgut. We got leaky gut. We got the immune system going crazy, trying to defend the cow's body. And we got the liver, the body's biochemical factory not working the way it should be. What could go wrong with all of this stuff?
Larry, I know you love a good sports analogy. And football is often cited as the ultimate team sport because it takes 11 men on offense, all going the same direction, everybody doing their job, same on defense, same on the special teams. And all it takes is one offensive lineman missing a block or a twist or a stunt or misreading a blitz by a quarterback and not changing the protection to wreck the whole system. And boy, what you just told me was that the biological system that is a cow is really the ultimate team sport.
Mm-hmm.
And the job from a nutrition perspective is to just give each one of those systems the tools that it needs to do its job, quite frankly, the way God intended.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And yeah, when you're asking different parts of that biological system to do the job of another part, what could go wrong?
Yep.
What could go wrong with bringing in the wide receiver that's 160 pounds and lining them up in the backfield to pick up blitzes against the big NFL linebackers?
Yep.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, what could go wrong? But that's what happens with our cows.
Yep.
And so it's little bits here, little bits there. And I think that's, Scott, why some herds we see relatively lower to medium risk levels of DON having greater effects on cows, greater negative effects than higher levels at another dairy. Because maybe it's just DON at this dairy versus multiple mycotoxins here. What all challenges is the cow trying to deal with? And now we're putting just one more challenge. So DON can affect each part of the cow's body. It's not just a rumen influence. It can influence each part of the cow's body.
So I want to bring up DON-resistant microbes. So there's a thought that some bacteria can tolerate DON, but it's maybe not necessarily the good guys.
Maybe not necessarily the most efficient good guys. So
Okay.
there are some organisms that can tolerate DON, but now we're going from being dependent, or shall we say, utilizing the most efficient organism, to now it's the low efficient but tough, durable organisms that are tolerant to DON. Anyhow, we've lost feed efficiency. We've lost our ability to fully make use of the diet that has been most correctly formulated because we don't have the most efficient organisms fermenting that diet in the rumen.
That makes sense. Speaking of feed efficiency, I mean, when you walk through the list of things that we know DON can impact, obviously, if we're seeing symptoms like erratic manure, that's leading us to believe there's hindgut fermentation, we intuitively know that we're not being as efficient with the TMR as we can.
Hmm.
I'm one, Larry. I don't like to put a number on toxin levels. That's just me, and I've kind of arrived that way after working in this space for
Hmm.
the last number of years because of one of your comments you just said. Why is it that a herd that is consistently at 1.5 ppm DON, seemingly not having any issues,
Yep.
and yet that the neighbors herd at 1.5 ppm are having all kinds of problems? They're not making any milk, they're not getting cows bred, and it's because of those stacked challenges
Hmm.
and how that cow is allocating
Yep.
nutrients. However, everybody likes to talk numbers. I don't. So I think there's a lot of value in knowing the levels on a part per million basis of DON in your TMR, in your corn silage.
Hmm.
But I think the benefit of knowing it's there outweighs to some degree the actual level. And if we know it's there, we can now put on our Sherlock Holmes glasses and go see if there's any clinical symptoms showing up.
You know, I think that'd be fair to say. We're putting another dot on the wall to help us connect the dots so that we get a picture of what's going on. If
Yep.
we don't know what's there for mycotoxins, we're not as able to fully deduce what our challenge truly is. And I think if we know these mycotoxin levels over time, it helps us to see what is shifting in the diet, what's shifting in the cow's performance, and we're better able to truly figure out what is happening. So the more information points I can have, the more likely I am to truly determine what the challenge or challenges are. And if nothing else, we start to eliminate potential challenges.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's a big one. And I'm going to do a callback to a previous episode we did right now. And that's going to be episode 59, folks. It dropped on November 3rd. 9 months of pain, all because testing came too late.
Mhm.
If nothing else, if we were testing regularly, we could have maybe just ruled mycotoxins as not a contributing factor.
Yep.
And in best case scenario, rather than suffering through 9 months of diagnostic struggles, we could have determined that, hey, there is significant reason to investigate mycotoxin related issues.
Hmm.
And potentially we could have treated that situation 9 months before we did.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
just I think about some of those situations, and I go back to when I was on the dairy with my father, and I just remember the emotional toll that it would take on myself and my father when things weren't going right and it felt like we were just beating our heads against the wall. And turns out we were just dealing with a mycotoxin problem that could have been
Hmm.
solved relatively easily.
Hmm.
The last thing I want to get to is, can you expand on Don interrupting the rumen liver immune communication? Talk us through that. What does that mean?
All right. Well, part of it is if we lose control of the rumen, in that we have fermentation now not occurring. So now we've got nutrients ending up in the small intestine that might be utilized by bacteria that are pathogens or going on to the hindgut. Now we have destruction taking place of the intestinal lining, and now we have items due to gut permeability that are ending up in the liver, where the liver is trying to deal with these as toxins, and liver isn't functioning as properly as what it should be. So again, it comes to our river analogy, making sure we use nutrients in the proper spot so they don't end up in other places to contribute to pathogens and undesirable organisms attacking the gut lining. And then anytime these pathogens, these mycotoxins or other digestive products end up in the body, we have these oxidative products created because we have cell membranes being destroyed. Think of it as we got cannonballs now bouncing around the body, destroying membranes, creating more of these oxidative species. We need more antioxidants to stop the cannonballs, and all of this contributes to what the liver is trying to deal with. So again, a challenge in this part of the body results in challenges in other parts.
Yeah.
And now these parts, they can handle that challenge, but they're not going to be as efficient as what they could be. And overall, we're losing because now the liver is trying to detoxify instead of most efficiently process nutrients as possible.
Yep. That makes perfect sense. Well, Larry, I really appreciate you taking time out of your day today. So I'm just going to kind of wrap this up and I'll ask you to give your input too. But, my question at the beginning was, why is DON so disruptive to rumen microbial balance? And if I were to break it down into 5 key points that I'd like the listener to take home, and I'll ask you to expand or comment. It's disruptive because it stops microbes from doing their job, which is then going to help shift rumen pH and microbial composition, weakening the gut barrier integrity, activating the immune system. And at the end of the day, that's going to quietly erode performance. And oftentimes long before we ever see obvious symptoms. Your takeaway, and we'll close it up.
No, I think it's that right there. Rumen organisms aren't functioning the way that they should be. They're slowed down, hitting the pause button. We have things passing out of the rumen that shouldn't be, that now feed pathogens. We lose our castle wall integrity. Liver doesn't function the way that it should be, and we have more inflammation to deal with throughout the body, and nutrients are going to non-productive purposes instead of productive. And gradually this happens over time, so slowly that we don't really notice it until one day we say, wow, our milk production's way off. Wow, our preg rates are way lower than what they used to be. It was a slow, gradual decline down.
And that's like the definition of drift. To go back to your river analogy, think of the boat that's on the edge of the ocean, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're sitting in the boat, you almost don't even realize you're drifting.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some other people can see it, but all of a sudden you wake up and there's no land in sight. And you just quietly drifted away. And there you go. So, well, I think we have brought this conversation home. Larry, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. We're going to see everybody again in 2 weeks, and we will bring you some more information, a similar deep dive on another mycotoxin. All right. See everybody in 2 weeks. Thanks, Larry.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Ruminate This with Agrarian Solutions. Look for our next episode in 2 weeks.